Hey there, welcome back to Transformed Worship. I'm hoping that you've been following our messages so far. Today, we are going to talk about deliverance, freedom, and the law. So, our message last week just kind of skimmed over the rest of Genesis from Noah to Joseph and Egypt. We briefly touched on Exodus 1 last week, and we're going to continue that journey. That's why I hope that you've been following along online. We've covered how everything went from perfect to broken, how mankind was scattered and divided, and how people became enslaved and distant from God. Today, we're going to see how God delivers them, and we're going to look at the first major and explicit set of laws God gives to mankind, the Ten Commandments. So the first several chapters of Genesis gives us all of mankind's origins and the origin of the earth. But it shifts from collecting world history into following a specific line and people group, the Israelites. Now remember, this is following people whose lineage can be traced all the way directly back to Adam and Eve, the first two humans. The beginning of Exodus 1 caught us up to where the Israelites, often called Hebrews here, are dealt with in an increasingly harsh way by the Egyptians who've enslaved them. Exodus chapter 1 verses 11 through 14 tells us how the Egyptians increasingly feared them. So the lives of the Hebrews worsened. The king of Egypt takes additional action to deal with these fears. Verse 15 begins. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. Do you remember our Journey to Christmas series? Do you remember how King Herod ordered the slaughter of all male children under 3 when he was looking for the Messiah? That's not the only similarity that we can find. So let's look at these next verses beginning with 17. The midwives, however, feared God, and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all of his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. If anybody doesn't know, the Nile is a river in Egypt. Now you don't want to take note here, because we're going to mention this again shortly. The God-fearing Hebrew women refused to take an innocent life and lie to the king to protect what they were doing to preserve life. Notice how the king responds with a new command. Throw the boys into the river. He figures, if you can't get there before they're born and kill them at birth, go ahead and throw them into the river, whichever Hebrew boys you find. Now Exodus 2 picks up telling us about the birth of a man named Moses. This man is used for a very important purpose in God's plan, and many have heard the name. Remember how God delivered Noah and his family by using a vessel, an ark? Exodus 2 verse 3. But when she could hide him no longer, Moses' mother, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. We know the family line that Moses came from, And we know how we have a record of his origin all in these first 4 verses. His sister stayed and watched what happened to him. Verses 5 through 10 tells us that Pharaoh's daughter, and a Pharaoh is the Egyptian name for a king, for their king, the Egyptian king. Title, it's the name of their title. Had one of her handmaidens care for him until he was older. So Pharaoh's daughter then gave him the name Moses. Life can be brutal, and the things that our ancestors have endured to move us forward to this point are nothing short of amazing. We really ought to spend some time reflecting on God and how truly awesome and loving He is. It's hard, but even in the darkest of nights, God's light finds a way to shine hope into our lives. And the stuff we deal with today, it's hard to think about the past and how much better off we have it today. But we really do. We have it so much better off. There's so many things that we could talk about for hours on end. But we are better off today than our ancestors were. So moving on to our next point. While Moses was delivered from persecution, he didn't live in Egypt long into adulthood before he fled. Moses was caught up in some drama, and you can read about that in verses 11 through 15. And he ends up spending some time in exile in the desert with a group of people. During this time and with these people, Moses found a wife. He had a son. He grew, he matured, and he wrestled with his doubts. Exodus chapter 2, verse 23 to 25 tells us, during that long period, the king of Egypt died while Moses was in exile. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So we know that Moses was gone from Egypt long enough for the heat to cool down, and we also see in here more about God's character, more about how we can understand and relate to God. He hears our pain. He has concern for our pain. He remembers his promises, and because he remembers his promises, he keeps them. Now remember, this is about 500 years since Joseph to Egyptian slavery. So imagine how they must have felt. That's a long period of time to them. But God exists outside of time. That is not a long period of time to him. And he kept his promise in his timing. And we may not like that. We may not like that we have to wait our whole lives, or even a month or a year, for something from God. We don't like the idea of potentially not receiving from God in this life. But history tells us that you don't always receive from God in your lifetime. God's people may not be rewarded until after you have died, or until after your children have died, or until after your grandchildren have died. We need to keep that in mind to try to fight our feelings of impatience, right? Because God makes a promise, but we get impatient while we're waiting for him to come through. You know, we read about Jesus coming back and the world coming to an end, sin finally being forever defeated, us being restored and freed from all the pain and suffering. And we can't even make it a year or two, let alone a few months, most of us, if we're honest with ourselves and with others, before we start to doubt that Jesus is actually going to come back, that God is going to keep his promise. But we have to remember that we have to have faith. We have to look at what God has shown us about him and in history, and stop thinking that we are supposed to have a God that serves us when we exist to serve and glorify Him. It's not about our feelings, it's about God's timing and His plan. So returning to Moses' exile, it was also during this time that God came to him in a burning bush and spoke to him audibly. So let's read chapter 3, beginning with verse 4. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses!" And Moses said, "Here I am." Does that remind you, thinking back to the Garden of Eden? God came to see them, and they had to respond, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The first thing to take note of here is that God commands Moses to remove his sandals and respect the ground that he is standing on. This is an indicator of respect and reverence owed to God when we approach him and enter his space. The other thing to note is that God explains to Moses who he is, as if Moses doesn't know. We can see that Moses must have had some kind of knowledge of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or God's referencing them would be meaningless to Moses. So he must have had an idea about his lineage, but maybe he forgot about the God of those people, or maybe he thought that God had abandoned them. Remember, this was living in a society where people had several gods. The Egyptians worshipped several gods. We've already read about how God heard the cries of his people at the end of the last chapter. But you can read about how he calls Moses to be the instrument of his deliverance in chapter 3, verses 7 through 14. I would encourage you to do that. I would encourage you to think about how God is patient with Moses, how Moses keeps questioning him. Really think about that interaction and try to imagine witnessing this conversation. Try to see what God is showing you about his character and what Moses is showing, what you're seeing about Moses' character. Moses twice doubts and asks God in his doubt, well, what about this? What about that? God responds with answers of power. And their conversation continues into chapter 4 before Moses returns to Egypt. Now the people have increasingly suffered in the 500 years since Joseph ruled in Egypt. Abram and Sarai had doubts when God promised them a child in their old age. Abram doubted God to protect him when he and Sarai arrived in Egypt. Eve doubted God's word. Her son Cain refused to accept it. And others we didn't talk about between Noah and Joseph didn't keep their trust in God. Do you see the cycle yet? Can you see the pattern? Do you understand it? See, God keeps telling mankind about things, but mankind keeps failing to trust what he says. They keep failing to walk that line, but what does God do? God remains consistent. He doesn't decide, okay, I'm going to change up what I'm doing because my people can't walk the line and follow me. He holds to his word. I've heard so many stories from people who were hurt by the people in the Christian church. And it hurts my heart, truly, to hear them, because now they distrust the Bible. Or now they have left their relationship with God. Or now they've done both. And it hurts my heart because I've been there. I've experienced that hurt from the people in the church. And I've wrongly allowed my negative interactions with the people in the church to get between me and God. But listen, we keep seeing how God uses imperfect people to achieve his goals. when Adam and Eve messed up, he could have wiped them out and started over, right? He probably could have. We don't know for sure because God is God and only He knows for sure. But let's speculate that He could have wiped them out and started over. Moses had problems. Abram had problems. But God kept using them anyway. So let's think about why, right? Why, if God has historically used imperfect people to fulfill His goal, to accomplish His goals, if God kept allowing imperfect people to become kings over His people, to lead His people, then why do we go to church today expecting the people of today to be perfect when not one person in history besides Jesus was able to hit that goal? Now, one person was without sin in all of history except Jesus. So why do we set the mark so high for the people in the church? Why do we elevate man to the same level as God? Because I think if we're honest, we'll realize that it's not about the people. It's about us wanting to push God and His design for our lives away from us. Right? Because if we can blame the people who represent Him in the church, then we don't have to live our lives according to what God has to say. Now, do you refuse to go to the gym because other people who go to the gym are not in perfect condition? Do you refuse to go to restaurants because the servers or the cooks can't perfectly perform their jobs? I bet if you're being logically consistent and intellectually honest, you'll say no to both of those things. Realistically, we don't go to the gym because we're lazy, right? Not because other people are not going to be in shape. But think about those questions. I bet you don't treat anything else in life, no other area in your life like you treat the church. Avoiding it because the people at that business or that place or whatever it is have made mistakes. And I bet you don't punish yourself when you make mistakes the same way that you punish a pastor or a deacon or an elder or just some person who attends church. Ask yourself if you're being logically consistent when you refuse to go to church because of the broken people in the building, but won't refuse to go anywhere else. And let me point out to you that Jesus regularly sat with the people that the society, the religious leaders of the time condemned, the sinners, the broken. Jesus regularly spent time with them, witnessing them. He didn't push them away. Think about whether you're being logically consistent when you claim the Bible is a worthless book written by men to control people with lies, but you have no problem following the law. You have no problem following the government's authority. You don't have no problem listening to medical professionals, dietitians, nutritionists, training manuals, owner's manuals, or any other type of instruction. You don't say, oh, well, that's man's word, so I'm not going to listen to it. So why do it to the Bible? Especially when the Bible claims that it is God's revealed word to mankind. And I'm not saying that nobody else has doubt. I'm just saying think about that. Hold yourself accountable. Be logically consistent, okay? If you're going to reject God, the church, and the Bible on those grounds, then you need to start rejecting other things on the same grounds. Exodus 5 through 6 records the beginnings of the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. It also records more of Moses' doubts and struggles as a man called to lead. You can find Moses and his brother Aaron's family record in chapter 6, verses 13 through 27. And yes, there are people today who insist that Moses didn't exist. Exodus 7 records more of the struggle to free the people, because this isn't something that happened overnight. This isn't something that was easy, and it definitely didn't happen instantly. The actual Exodus doesn't begin until chapter 12, after God has sent plagues upon Egypt to demonstrate his power over reality. So long story short, so we can get to our points for today, the Israelites are freed from Egypt and they cross the Red Sea as God parts it. The Egyptians tried to pursue along the bed of the Red Sea, but God closed the sea back up, and all the Egyptians that were chasing them on the seabed drowned. The Egyptians didn't want to allow them to escape because they were losing their slaves. So now we're going to turn to chapter 19, picking up 2 months after the Exodus. And verse 1 begins, "On the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day, they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, 'This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did in Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites.' So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, 'We will do everything the Lord has said.' So Moses brought their answers back to the Lord. God again says to his people, repeating that cycle, repeating that pattern, 'You must do this, and I will do this as your reward.' So what do you think is going to happen? We'll find out shortly, but first, let's see what happens when Moses meets God at the top of Mount Sinai in Exodus 20. Exodus 20 contains what is known as the 10 Commandments. Many think these 10 are all there is to God's law, but this is just the beginning of God giving the law to Moses for society to follow. We will not read any more about the Israelites today, because we don't get back to them until chapter 32. That's 12 chapters of God giving instruction to Moses for how he expects them to live post-Exodus. Now the 10 Commandments can be divided into 2 categories. They probably shouldn't be, but a lot of people do. And I'm going to explain those categories just to give you so you've heard of it before. Your relationship with God, verse 5, and your relationship with the community. The first 5 deal with the relationship with God, while the second 5 deal with your relationship with the community. However, I would say, and I strongly recommend that you adopt this view, that the commandments shouldn't be separated. I would say that all 10 of them are very deeply intertwined with your relationship to God and the community. I don't believe that any of those commandments can be ignored without affecting both your relationship with God and your relationship with the community. So commandment number 1, chapter 20, verse 3. You shall have no other gods before me. That is a crystal clear statement. God is the only God, and we are not to follow imitation gods. We are not to follow the rituals or practices of imitation gods or imitation religions. Why would he bother saying this? Again, the Israelites, after 500 years, were in a culture that had multiple gods. Now remember, also, Merriam-Webster defines the word religion in part as a cause, principle, or system of beliefs held to with ardor and faith. That is the third definition listed for the English noun. Commandment number 2 in 20 verses 4 through 6. You shall not make for yourselves an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So we are not to have any material representation of or image of anything in heaven or on earth. We don't mean in heaven as in God. We mean as in the heavens of his creation, like the sky, the universe, the earth, the waters. All that is what we're talking about here. We're not talking about heaven where God resides. The reason being, these are created things, and we are to worship the Creator, not the creation. Beyond this command is God's promised reward and punishment, very clearly spelled out here. Break it, and he will punish the generations after you, but he will show his love to many more generations after you if you love and obey him. This is a clear statement that parents must not create idols for themselves, their family, or their homes. Yes, he doesn't specifically call out parents, but parents need to realize that they are setting the tone, because more is caught than taught to your children. Meaning, children learn more from watching you and the things that you do than what you say to them. Commandment number 3, 20 verse 7. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Are you consciously aware that you break this commandment every time you say OMG? Same thing as saying, oh my God. What about when you say GD? And I'm abbreviating that for the swear word. Or you say Jesus Christ as a curse. Or oh my Lord. Or any other time you toss out that name. The name of God, the name of Jesus. Or another word in the Bible that references God. Ask yourself, would you do the same thing with your child's name or the name of your mother? Would you take their name and use it in place of a curse word? Again, we're calling you to be logically consistent. Commandment 4, 20, 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. God set this standard back in Genesis when he labored for 6 days and rested for one. Jesus tells us that the Sabbath is made for us, not us for it. We are given a Sabbath day by God because we need to recharge ourselves, our bodies, minds, souls. This specific commandment covers work, but where does it command church attendance on a specific day? That's right, it doesn't. Why doesn't it? Because when God is speaking to the Israelites, this is coming from the expectation that this society will be obedient. It will be God-fearing. It will be theocratic, meaning ruled by God and his laws. So they should already be in the pattern of worshiping God, because their society should already be honoring him all day, every day. Remember how the intro to the law begins with God specifically telling his people to obey? Commandment 5, 2012. Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Most people stop reading after honor your father and your mother. This is the second commandment that carries a promise with it. Do not dishonor your parents, or you will not live long in the land God is giving you, in the land God has for you. See, God isn't explicitly saying you will die if you don't listen to your parents. Nor is he saying that you will live forever if you do listen to them or obey them. What he is saying here is that these specific people will live for a long time in this flourishing land that he's about to give them if they honor their parents. Now, that's not reason to take off and start disrespecting your parents. Why? Because there are other places in the scripture, some of which we've covered, that do say to obey your parents, and they aren't targeting specific people. They don't come with a specific promise or command attached to it, like in the land I'm giving you, which if we're thinking in context, it's the land he's going to give to the Israelites post-Exodus. But these commands also require careful discernment in families, much of the Bible. Number 6, you shall not murder, 2013. This one also seems very straightforward, yet mankind finds a way to complicate it by oversimplifying. Remember post-flood when God was speaking to Noah? Thinking back to what he said about shedding blood, he didn't say that the lifeblood of a being couldn't be shed. He said he will demand an accounting for it. We won't dive deep into it today, but the Bible does explain there's a difference between murder and self-defense. In fact, Jesus reinforces God's pro-life stance in the Sermon on the Mount found in Matthew 5 when he speaks about our attitudes and our hearts. Self-defense or the defense of another comes from love, while murder comes from hate. Commandment 7, 2014. You shall not commit adultery. We've dived into adultery before, taking it down to the original language to accurately understand. Something we often do here, because we strive to know the truth from the source instead of following what man has said for centuries, when most of it's been twisted. But the word used here in Exodus means two things. It means to have relationships with someone other than your spouse, have relations. Here and throughout the OT, but it also Old Testament, but it also means to be spiritually unfaithful in the context of Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 9. Jesus takes it to another level, also in Matthew 5, by explaining again that it begins with the desire or the attitude you have. And he's explaining that to even long for or covet anyone other than your spouse is the same as to commit adultery. Commandment 8, 2015, you shall not steal. The original language means to thieve, deceive, and or steal. Pretty straightforward here. Commandment 9, 2016, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. The church has historically taught this commandment out of context, saying it is a commandment against lying. Again, that's an oversimplification. Does God forbid lying? Yes. And we'll cover that a little bit before we're done. But that doesn't seem to be the correct understanding when you read this commandment. It says, shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Seems to be referencing a court of law. It seems to be referencing justice. You shall not say that your neighbor did something that he or she didn't do. Commandment 10, the last, 2017. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Some churches have removed one of the first 3 commandments and split this last one into 2. Not to pick on them, but traditional Catholic practice is one example of this. They removed commandment 2, the one about not making images of anything and not worshiping any of those images. And I've shown you that it's plainly written in the Bible itself. And we're also looking at the final commandment, which is presented in a single verse. So there isn't any base reason to justify splitting covetousness into 2 separate commandments. So what does it mean to covet? Coveting is selfish desire. It's often controlled, uncontrolled, and lustful. Now God delivers the Israelites from slavery and suffering. In doing so, he promised them more than just deliverance. He also promised them a thriving life if they obey him. God doesn't just dictate how things will go for us. He expects us to join him as the leader of our team so that we can cooperate in order to achieve his goals. And if we're following God and chasing after our relationship with him, his goals become our goals. And God has taught us a lot about who he is, who we are, and what he expects from us. Exodus 23-7 reveals that God is jealous and that he cares about justice. We also see that God expects loyalty, respect, and obedience. And God gives us instructions to build and maintain a healthy community in Exodus 28-17. First, recognize the day of rest given to you so that you, your family, your animals, and therefore your community remain healthy. The benefits of keeping the Sabbath covers your spiritual, mental, and physical health. God cares about your whole being, and so do we at TCM. Next, in verse 12, 14, and 17, he tells us how to keep a healthy and functioning family. And we don't need to ask why about this one, because we have plenty of statistics showing us that the state of the world, the family and community today can be traced back to two root causes. Households without a mother and a father, and households and communities who've abandoned their respect and submission to God. All of these commands cause problems in our communities and families. Coveting is a problem because the attitude focuses on what you don't have instead of being grateful for that which you do. It harms the self and those around you and makes you discontent. It steals your joy. And it steals the moments, the precious moments that you have in life that you can celebrate and be grateful for. Proverbs 6, verse 16 through 19 contains what's often referred to as the 7 deadly sins. The passage reads, and we're going to skim over it, there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. Verse 17, a lying tongue. 18, a heart that devises wicked schemes. 19, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. A lot rooted into being honest as a human being, how important that is. And we have so much more that we can cover on these subjects, but remember that God gave us this collection of books for all of our benefit. This is more than a revelation of how to be saved from eternal damnation, and it is a guidebook for our lives so that we, our families, and our communities can thrive. The answer to pain and suffering in the world is simply that we choose not to obey God.